Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on coping with CUP, navigating the unknown. Today, we are focusing on a rare cancer, cancer of unknown primary, otherwise known as CUP, in which we have a cancer that has spread, but we do not know where the cancer originated from. We will be focusing on the specifics of this diagnosis, potential treatment strategies, as well as the emotional journey for patients and caregivers. My name is Hetal Vig, and I'll be the moderator for this session. I am the Director of Research and Clinical Engagement here at TargetCancer Foundation. As a cancer genetic counselor for many years, I've worked at the intersection of academic medicine and precision diagnostics to try to bridge the gap between complex genomic data and patient care to really empower families and patients to really take control of their health through better information. And so it's really a privilege today to talk to both Dr. Huey and Tanya regarding this very important topic. For those new to our community, TargetCancer Foundation is a patient-founded rare cancer research and patient support foundation based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was founded in 2009 to fill a much-needed gap, as there were no effective treatments for rare cancer patients at that time. Since 2009, we have worked to advance the development of more effective and personalized treatments for people with rare cancer. We do this through 3 pillars, which include patient education materials and webinars such as this one, scientific meetings such as our annual think tank on advancing precision medicine and rare cancers, and innovative research like our decentralized TCF-001 clinical trial, which offers genomic testing and personalized recommendations for rare cancer patients, including CUP from across the United States. So today we are focusing on one of the most complex diagnoses in oncology. Any cancer diagnosis is overwhelming, but the diagnosis of cancer of unknown primary is a rare cancer with added uncertainty, which makes it more challenging for both patients and providers. And that's why it's very important to highlight this to our community. We've brought together 2 incredible perspectives, clinical and patient caregiver perspectives, to share their expertise to help us spread awareness on CUP and educate patients facing this very difficult diagnosis. In terms of housekeeping, we will have the chat open for questions, and I will be keeping an eye on the questions that come in for the panelists. We will prioritize more general questions as opposed to questions specific to your case, as that's best directed to your treating physician. So before we dive in to our discussion, I'd like our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share how their journey intersected with CUP. I'll start with Dr. Huey, who is a GI medical oncologist at MD Anderson with a specialization in CUP. Dr. Huey.
Thanks, Hetal. And it's great to be here today and join this community for such an important discussion. As you said, I'm a GI medical oncologist and associate professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. I've been here for several years, and my research and clinical interests lie in the realm of CUP. And we have the opportunity to see a lot of patients in clinic and also try to stand up research programs to answer the many unmet needs and unanswered questions that exist in this space, some of which we'll get to talk about today. But we've tried to define some of the more common subsets of CUP and kind of how best to treat these patients, and done some work in molecular diagnostics and a handful of other things. And most importantly, just really have a heart for caring for this patient population. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. And Tanya Knott is founder and director of the Sarah Jennifer Knott Foundation and co-founder of the World CUP Alliance. Tanya, if you could share a little bit about yourself and how your journey has intersected with CUP. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm delighted to be here today with Ryan, and congratulations to all of you there in TargetCancer Foundation. Unbelievable work you've all been doing for the past 14, 15 years. So basically, I think nobody sets out to be a patient advocate. We often joke about this with our colleagues. It's something that kind of happens, I suppose. My journey with CUP started when my sister was 30. She was diagnosed with cancer of unknown primary. She was the youngest of four girls. She's probably the healthiest out of all of us. Um, and my background was I'm a nurse and I was working in oncology at the time. So once we kind of recovered from the shock when she was so sick and to have a cancer diagnosis, I kind of explained to her, oh, this will happen. You'll have a nurse specialist. Everything will work out. You'll follow a pathway. You'll have all this information and support. And as her journey went on and we were trying to find out what her diagnosis was, I realized how little was known. We had like no specialist nurse. We had no information. It was from her first diagnosis, 3 months until she got a diagnosis of CUP. Up until then, they thought it might be lymphoma. Then we were told it was germ cell. So it was a constant kind of roller coaster to try and get a diagnosis, never mind start treatment. So just trying to find all this information was just mind-boggling. And I think especially in an information age where there's so much information, to think that you can't find anything was even more frightening. And it's even with my own experience, and it was just a complete shock. So I eventually found a charity in the UK, which John Simmons has started. And it was only then I started to really find information. And I started doing a huge amount of research myself, trying to find out what best care for her, any clinical trials, what was the best medication she could be on, really just trying to find what the best we could do for her. And it was very challenging, really. But I think she died 18 months later, but I felt when I had all this information and what was I going to do with it, I felt I really needed to share it. So I started up the Sarah Jennifer Knott Foundation. We began, it's nearly 9 years ago now, and it started with our friends and our family. And it was really brilliant because we could felt so hopeless that we could actually maybe try and do something. But it wasn't as easy as we thought. We started fundraising. First of all, I think the most important thing we did was set up a website, get information for patients, to even have a booklet. When Sarah was diagnosed, we didn't even have a booklet, so we didn't know where we were going or anything like that. So we produced a booklet and we started fundraising. And then we got to our first huge amount of money. We decided we were thinking this is easy now, we can give it for research. But there was so little research going on in Ireland and Europe, and we didn't know, we couldn't even give the money away. So then we had to find researchers to do some research for us. Luckily, there was a global Capisco trial ongoing at the time. So I started getting invited to meetings, which was a huge benefit because then I started to meet experts in the field and I could chat to them about particular research they were doing. I suppose, first of all, in Ireland, we tried to set up research funding in a molecular tumour board because I felt the numbers in Ireland are approximately 400 patients per year get diagnosed. So the whole of the country doesn't need to know about CUP, let's say. It might never ever affect them. But from the CUP patient's point of view, precision oncology is where we really want to focus. So we feel that the whole world needs to know about that and have access to precision oncology. So the first thing we did was try and get funding to have a national molecular tumour board. So we really got involved with that and we've helped set up the National Molecular Tumour Board so the patients are treated, they can come here. But the other thing was then we found research, other ideas. We work very closely with Dr. Barcelona and fund a lot of his research that he's doing in other cancer types that he can do in CUP. But from there we met Juanita Minard, who set up a similar charity in the Netherlands. She lost her fiance at 31. So together then we formed the World Cup Alliance, which we can talk about more later, where we met Ryan and where we have a fantastic community now of CUP experts all coming together and kind of working really closely together on all the various research we're doing and trying to kind of really highlight the needs of CUP patients.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for highlighting your journey. We'll definitely come back to some of those points because you've made a lot of great points that we want to make sure our listeners really understand in terms of the journey that you've made and how you've informed patients across the globe through your organization. But let me start from the beginning, just for the audience who may not be as familiar with CUP. Dr. Huey, if we could start with you, the name itself, cancer of unknown primary, can be very confusing to patients. Can you define what is CUP exactly? And maybe how does it differ in terms of what you tell patients when we don't have a known primary versus when we do have a known primary?
Of course. Yeah, that's exactly where I like to start with a lot of patients. I'm at a referral center, so a lot of times I am providing second opinions for patients after they have had some form of initial workup. And what I tell people is, um, you know, cancer of unknown primary is a situation, unlike most cancers, as you mentioned, usually someone has a mass in the breast, and then we take a biopsy of that, and the pathology report says, look, this is breast cancer, or the same is similar for the prostate or the lung or something else. Any kind of solid tumor typically works like that. And even when a cancer has spread somewhere else, a metastatic cancer, we can typically get a biopsy and have an understanding of where exactly the cancer has started, even if it's in multiple locations. What is unique about CUP is there is something that doesn't fit with the puzzle. The imaging and what the cancer looks like under the microscope just doesn't totally align with one another. There is some sort of mystery about it, or I tell people the puzzle pieces just don't fit together. And so we may have a mass in the lung and a handful of other places, and yet it doesn't look like lung cancer, for instance. And so there is something that is unusual about the pathology. It may be that a cancer looks like it starts in a particular location. Let's say the colon, for instance. By that, I mean, if you were to just look at the cancer cells under the microscope as a pathologist, you would say, well, this is colon cancer. And yet we do testing that doesn't show a mass in the colon or doesn't show a mass in the rectum. And so, there is this kind of, it may look like a pretty straightforward type of cancer, for instance, and yet we can't see any kind of mass in that place where we would have expected it to have started. And so by definition, this is a cancer that has started somewhere and spread to another part of the body. And yet there is something mysterious that doesn't allow us to find that place that it originally started. And what I tell people is this can be unbelievably frustrating for patients and their caregivers. I think that I tell patients that they almost never get to my clinic without a sense of frustration and or confusion as to why it seems like no one can tell them exactly what's going on, or why people can't even do something as simple as label their diagnosis. Your friend asks you, what kind of cancer do you have? And you say cancer of unknown primary. And they say, what do you mean they don't know where it's coming from? And so you kind of get this accusatory tone, and then you start to wonder, like, did I ask my team the right questions, and what's going on here? It's not something that is intuitive to either clinicians or patients, for that matter. And so it can be very confusing. And so one of the things that we do is we say, look, cancer of unknown primary does exist. This is about 2 to 4% of cancer diagnoses. This is what it is. And this is kind of what we do about it. And I know we'll get into that a little bit more. But we just have to acknowledge the existence of the rare cancer first in order for people to feel validated that someone has an idea and an understanding as to what's going on. Because I think at least initially, especially with what can be a long search for a primary site of cancer, for a primary tumor, that can lead to a tremendous amount of distress for patients as well. So that's probably the first place to start.
Thank you for that explanation. That's really important to understand also that CUP is a diagnosis. Sometimes patients and caregivers think that, as you had mentioned, Dr. Huey, that it's kind of a question mark, that there's maybe not a specific diagnosis, but actually it accounts for 2 to 4%, and it is an actual diagnosis of cancer that is potentially can be a little bit better defined with more testing and help dictate treatment. Tanya, can you explain a little bit about what's going through a patient and caregiver's mind during this kind of diagnostic odyssey to get to the point of even arriving at a CUP diagnosis? What are the emotions that are going through a patient and caregiver's mind?
I suppose with the cup, like Ryan says, there's no definite mass anywhere. So sometimes a lot of the patients present with vague symptoms. So
Mhm.
sometimes they might have been having these vague symptoms for quite a while and maybe repeat visits back and forwards to the GP with kind of nothing known yet. And it might seem like it's taken a long time to even get a cancer diagnosis at the first part. And it can be very frustrating and challenging because patients are not feeling well. Another thing that happens is sometimes I think the research has shown up to 54% of patients can present as an acute emergency, which is like what happened to my sister. She presented with a HB of 6, which when I saw that result, I knew was so low that there was something seriously wrong with her. So she'd kind of vague symptoms up until then. So I think that's what a lot of family and friends find, that it's kind of such a slow process to begin with. And then you get to the GP and you're kind of like feeling uncertain and you're not kind of sure what's going on. Then they might run a few tests and then get you into the hospital scene where you, depending on your first symptom, you will be probably under that team until they run some more tests. And this is where the real kind of problems occur because you're not, until you get a diagnosis, you don't belong to a certain team. So you're kind of in between you could fall through the sides anytime. They call this MDT tennis, where you're kind of sent from one team back to the other, which really resonated with us because that's exactly how we felt. So by the time you get to the hospital, sometimes patients can be feeling even more unwell and kind of more worried as to what's going on. And then they start doing lots of different diagnostic tests to try and kind of find out. And sometimes patients with CUP can have more tests than other patients because they're really trying to find out what's happening. And that can lead to more kind of frustration and worry. Um, and then of course they kind of, when they rule out other things and they start talking about a potential CUP diagnosis, I think that's when the real concern happens. And a lot of studies have shown that patients with rare cancers or unknown primary cancers suffer so much more psychologically at this stage because of the uncertainty. The uncertainty is probably one of the biggest psychological factors that's so hard to cope with, not
Mhm.
knowing. And patients often say that the time before the symptoms and the actual diagnosis was the worst time in their whole pathway. So for CUP patients, it seems to be even that bit longer because it's so extended. So I think, which is good from us, what we know now is that for CUP specialists to know to have early access to psychological support at this stage, to kind of help patients know that things are being done, to reassure that everything is being done and this is part of the situation, and as Ryan said, having an actual diagnosis of CUP, that it means something, that doctors do know what it is, as opposed to this feeling of they don't know what's wrong with me. How am I going to be treated if nobody knows? So that if doctors are suspecting CUP, that the kind of patient and the family can be prepared at that stage to know what it might be. But that's why sometimes the length of that time, it can be just so long and
Mhm.
very, 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 very worrying.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can only imagine how much time and emotional toll that this process takes to arrive at a diagnosis. Um, is there a sense of like how much more time it takes to arrive at a CUP diagnosis versus, you know, like a breast cancer or a colon cancer? I don't know if there's any data on that. I'm assuming obviously it's much longer, but I didn't know. And I'm sure it differs between health systems. Obviously, in Europe versus US, there may be different. A center of excellence or an NCI center may be different than a community hospital, but I didn't know if there was any sense of time to diagnosis.
Very good question. I must actually look into that. I know in the UK and Ireland and kind of Europe, the time to treatment, the hope is within 3 weeks from diagnosis for
Okay.
cancers. But definitely for CUP, it's much, much longer. But I must try and find out exactly
Yeah.
how long. But in our case, it was 3 months, which is
Hmm.
really long. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a range of timeframes that are quoted here. Certainly several are weeks, but at times it can be months. And
Yeah.
I certainly think we see that in real life because it is difficult and can be very confusing for clinical teams and
Mhm.
sometimes sometimes it's for reasons as straightforward as the pathology is not simple. And so it requires additional testing. And so even the turnaround time for what you would assume to be a pretty straightforward biopsy could take longer. I tell patients, look, if we're going to get a repeat biopsy, for instance, this is not going to be the kind of thing that's reported out the next day. This is going to take a little bit of time. And those things add up for sure. And can create a lot of distress. And as Tanya said, there can be real consequences and real clinical symptom burden that builds during that period of time. And so it's not insignificant.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can imagine when a diagnosis when you finally have a diagnosis of CUP, it's very easy to also still feel paralyzed in terms of now what do you do? What are my next steps? And do both of you, I can start with you, Tanya, in your experience, what advice or roadmap would you give a newly diagnosed patient or family to help navigate those first critical weeks? What was helpful for you?
Yes, I suppose it's that information need, isn't it, to try and gather as much information as you possibly can. And now, I suppose, with the World Cup Alliance, now we hope to have as much information as we can in as many languages. And again, with Target Cancer Foundation, with the information you have, to talk to the clinicians. If they're not in a centre of excellence, as you said, a second opinion is vital. I always try and find a second opinion to have some area of expertise. I know that mightn't be accessible for everybody, but if they can get a second opinion, just to know that they're trying all avenues to make sure that they've the best care that they possibly can have and access to like molecular profiling or different treatments, that they're informed, that they know what's out there, and to be aware of clinical trials. I know there's not an option for everybody, but just the more information you have, the more I think power you feel you have over it and control over the situation. Because I think the diagnosis of CUP is such a powerless situation where you feel like you just are completely alone, and even trying to find support groups, it can be very, very difficult. My sister was diagnosed 11 years ago, and how things have changed now is huge. I mean, if you look up now, the information is there, if to find it, and to even contact the likes of the World Cup Alliance or any rare cancer charities and ask the questions, ask for advice, because I know we're delighted when we get queries in that we can help or signpost somebody to the closest expert. Even on our website, we had a map, I think we're changing at the moment, just to show where the experts are. Even your consultant or your oncologist could make a call or send an email and ask for a second opinion or advice, because the expertise is huge in CUP, and not all oncologists are expert, obviously, in all different cancers.
No, thanks for bringing up the expertise aspect, because I really want to shed some light on how important it is to find expertise, both here in the US as well as internationally, and kind of build that true partnership with your provider. Perhaps Dr. Huey, if you could speak a little bit about the importance of finding expertise in CUP, and finding these centers who have these multidisciplinary teams who can work together.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. This expertise is hard to find. And I think what Tanya and Ornita have done with World Cup Alliance is really outstanding. It's bringing together a lot of clinicians, and not to mention patient advocates, who are really interested in this disease. And that can provide the opportunity to foster relationships and work together. We've developed collaborators around the world to hopefully ask important research questions. I had one of them mentioned in conversation yesterday, and plan later today to talk to others of them. These are active conversations, and really that can be built by relationships. I've also had clinicians, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago, say, do you have a CUP expert in some random city or state? And the answer was no. And I'm ashamed that the answer to that question was that we just don't have as great of a repository of folks that are really deeply invested in this malignancy as we would like. Obviously, there's a lot of general hematologists, oncologists who do a great job in the community caring for patients. There's no doubt about that. But these patients are even sometimes lost in academic medical centers and referral centers, because perhaps there's not a high enough volume for people to really develop a subspecialized expertise here. So it can be hard. There's just not as many there's not as many people invested in this space as we would like, and certainly not for you know, on behalf of patients as well. We want to try to change that. We want to try to continue to build more relationships and develop that expertise both in the United States and around the world. I agree with the notion that a second opinion can be really helpful, even if there is just a second opinion about pathology, for instance, because our pathologists are so key in ultimately telling us where cancer may have started from, which to be honest, for many cases, just dictates how we should best treat this. You know, CUP comes in many flavors, shall we say. There's CUP that resembles lung cancer. There's CUP that resembles gynecologic cancers or colon cancer or upper GI cancer, for instance. And a lot of times we select our treatment options based on what that resemblance is. And we may not be able to give it a name that is separate from CUP with a blank profile, CUP with a kidney cancer profile, CUP with a colon cancer profile. But those things can be really helpful. And so it's important to try to understand that as best as possible. I think the other thing that's really hard for patients upon initial diagnosis is how hard do you chase a primary cancer?
Yes.
And how much testing do you do? And where do you draw the line and say, look, we've just got to move in a direction of treatment. And we have to give up the hope of having things wrapped in a bow before starting treatment, because there are trade-offs associated with that delay, as we've kind of mentioned. And so you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. At some point, you may have to make a decision to just move forward with treatment using the available information. Second opinions can be helpful even after a patient has started treatment, because additional information may come back. But it may be that we can't wait for all of that data to return prior to developing a plan, even if that plan does not always feel perfect, because that's just the reality of the situation. I think that, you know, we want patients to have a basic and thorough workup. We want a high quality CT scan. We want additional imaging as kind of directed by pathology and symptoms and whatnot. We want, you know, good and appropriate biopsy, core needle biopsy for sufficient tissue for evaluation. And then there's a lot of other advanced diagnostics. Sometimes patients get endoscopies, a colonoscopy, for instance. Patients may have other testing done, but at some point, there's not just one more test that is likely to reveal the source. It doesn't mean you shouldn't look. It doesn't mean you should treat without kind of some appropriate workup. That's what's really hard, and where this comes into a very individualized set of circumstances, because some patients have a little bit longer to wait for that evaluation, but others just really need to get going on treatment, particularly if they're sick in the hospital with complications at the time of initial diagnosis. And so that is a very fine line to walk. I think that's a discussion to have with oncologists along the way, is how hard do we look for this? How long do we look for a primary site of cancer? And at what point do we just start treating, acknowledging that other data may come back down the road?
Thank you for that. I think it brings up an important point, which is, you know, how much do we rely on kind of trying to put the pieces together to guess a primary versus perhaps looking at molecular studies or molecular profiling to see whether or not a specific cancer has a profile or similar to a GI cancer or similar to breast cancer. Can you speak to the role of molecular profiling within the treatment realm? And perhaps, you know, is that something that's evolving in terms of CUP, in the CUP realm?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few good points here. Number one, I'm a huge advocate for oncologists having discussions with their pathologists, with their pathology colleagues. I mean, this is very much a pick up the phone type of situation. Rarely does a a diagnosis of CUP come across my desk where there is not some sort of conversation that happens with a pathologist, just to clarify, because there are sometimes things that are not said in the pathology report that are still relevant to how the case should be framed. And I think those can be really important pearls of wisdom along the way. But to your point, I think molecular profiling really kind of falls into two buckets. One are what's the molecular makeup of the cancer from a mutation or a fusion or a deletion amplification standpoint. We have typically thought of this as next generation sequencing. And, I think that this has become very much an important part of essentially all solid tumors that are metastatic. And I think that there have been there's been significant disparities in terms of which patients have access to next generation sequencing over the years and across the world. I think there are advocacy groups have done a really great job at trying to expand this and discuss how important this is for patients, because this could potentially lead to additional targeted therapy options, or could even conceivably make you think differently about how to treat a patient. I think if you find we found a fusion a couple of weeks ago that was classic for colorectal cancer. And despite a patient not having a tumor in the colon or the rectum, it became very evident to us that this cancer was in fact behaving like a colorectal cancer. And so in fact, we should treat it that way. And so that molecular diagnostic test was critical. But of course, we didn't have that at the initial diagnosis. Patients don't walk in the door having had that already done. And so it took a little bit of time for that to come back. I think there have been groups like ESMO, the European Society for Medical Oncology, who has kind of a rare cancer group that now advocates for all patients with rare cancers getting NGS, which I think is really great. And we hope that those guidelines and suggestions trickle down to potentially affect patients in a really positive way and improve outcomes. When it comes to CUP, I think another component that we should discuss is the role of something called a molecular cancer classifier. And so this can take various forms and fashions. For some time, analysis of something called gene expression profiling was done in order to evaluate what is the makeup of a cancer. And this would be compared against a library or repository of patients with tens of thousands of patients with so-called known primary cancers, so not unknown primary. So this would be a repository of patients with breast cancer and patients with colon cancer and lung cancer and pancreas cancer and the like. And there would be something like 20 some odd cancers that this could be compared against, with the idea being, okay, what is the gene expression profiling of a patient with CUP, and what does it match up to? And that can be very helpful. There are now newer tests that have been developed over the years that may incorporate next generation sequencing or whole exome sequencing, a variety of what I would say updated technologies in order to potentially predict the site of a cancer. There are some strengths and weaknesses with this approach. They definitely play an important role, and for some patients, they can be of tremendous value. I saw a patient recently, and we sent for NGS essentially along with a molecular cancer classifier, and all of a sudden a diagnosis of CUP became Merkel cell carcinoma, which we were not expecting. And so it was great to learn that. It really clarified what our treatment strategy should be, and we set that patient up with a Merkel cell carcinoma expert as well, and created a plan together. But sometimes these classifiers fall short. They don't always lead you to the promised land, and so that needs to be acknowledged whenever a test is sent. It can also be that one of these classifiers anchors a bit on some of the molecular makeup of a cancer. If a patient has a HER2 amplification, for instance, these classifiers are very likely to call that cancer breast cancer, because it's common in about 25% of breast cancers. but we should acknowledge that there are other cancers that also have HER2 amplifications. These may be bile duct cancers, these may be colorectal cancers, these may be bladder cancers. And so it may be that these classifiers don't always take into account those types of nuances. And so whenever I send it, I say, look, this can help. But if we get a test back and it's totally discordant with everything else that we've learned about your cancer along the way, we're not necessarily going to use that result in isolation to completely make our decisions with regard to treatment. So it's an important tool, in my opinion, but can't be used in isolation. It has to be used in the context of everything else that we've received as well.
Thank you. That was a great explanation, but it really points to the fact that there's so many clues in the detective work process and context that you really have to take into account, which highlights how important it is to partner with an expert in CUP who can really understand these nuances. It really seems like there is a potential evolving role for molecular profiling in NGS, as well as these molecular classifiers. But probably there needs to be an approach, at least with the molecular classifiers, that patients understand that there may be a bias in the reference kind of data set that we're looking at, and that needs to be explained. So patients, I'm sure they try to hook onto things once they find a result that could lead them to a direction that they have a defined, primary.
Absolutely. And that's one of the risks, if you want to call it that, of getting one of these tests, is that it can be a real anchor for patients. And there's a lot of tests that have entered this space over the last several years with what I would say is a wide range of utility. And there are some real limitations. I mean, if I get a test result back and it says there's a 30% chance of this being a pancreatic cancer, for instance, and everything else, all the other cancer types are below that, well, 30% isn't very high. So I'm not sure that's tremendously helpful. The other thing is, as you kind of alluded to, if you have a library of common cancers and you're trying to select which of those most resembles a patient's diagnosis of CUP, you miss a lot of uncommon cancers. You may not have the ability to diagnose a rare cancer, and that is a tremendous limitation in these cases. And so we have to think both about common and rare cancers. If you don't look for a rare cancer, you'll never find it, as Tanya, I'm sure, will attest to as well. And so you have to stay open-minded enough to think outside of the results of what may come with a molecular cancer classifier. Doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role, but I think acknowledging the blind spots is a really important thing to do.
Yeah, I can certainly understand that from a patient standpoint and a caregiver standpoint. When this data becomes available, that it has enormous potential to help guide treatment, as long as we understand the potential benefits and limitations. So speaking of treatment, I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit about the importance of clinical trials. This is obviously a rare cancer, as you mentioned, and is maybe not easy to find clinical trials that apply to CUP. But we want to make sure that patients on this webinar and patients who view this webinar later can understand how best to find clinical trials and how important it is in terms when we think about treatment, why they're important and how patients can benefit from clinical trials and how do they react to clinical trials even in the community. So maybe we can start with you, Tanya, in terms of what you feel like how do patients receive clinical trials in the CUP community? Do they feel like they're useful? Go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose the biggest problem is that there is just not that many. I mean, we have Cancer Trials Ireland, which I'm very, very much involved in. And a lot of our fundraising goes to Cancer Trials Ireland. But there is only a trial we're trying to get up and running ourselves here for patients to have access to NGS. And that's very slow to try and get it up. And we're hoping to fund the test for it So, and if you look, clinicaltrials.gov is where all the trials are around the world. But again, still very, very few trials
Mhm.
available. We really advocate for kind of basket trials for patients to be able to kind of get into smaller recruitment trials. Also, I think the role for us as advocates, talking to pharma, we are
Mhm.
talking to the top guys, saying that when they are going to run their trials, not to forget cancer of unknown primary patients and rare patients, to make them a priority, especially in the tumor agnostic field, where we think CUP can really benefit from all this new information and kind of highlight their needs. They're very much unmet needs. So when we do say to patients, do try and look for a clinical trial, with managing expectations that it is kind of very hard to find a trial, and will that trial make a difference? It might make a huge difference, you know. So it's really trying to get patients access, and that's the benefit of the clinical trials, that they can access maybe a targeted treatment or a test that they might not necessarily have had access to. But I think that's where your track trial is amazing, and in the States,
Yes.
that's exactly the kind of trial I think patients would want to be able to
Right. And Track offer is a decentralized trial that we offer through Target Cancer Foundation, where patients can have remote access to genomic testing, NGS testing, and profiling that can dictate perhaps a targeted therapy that gets reviewed by our expert tumor board every week and gets translated back to the treating team. So it is something that we would definitely welcome any CUP patients that are in need of this testing, because it is available in the US free of charge. I realize that in the Europe, we don't have this trial running, but we hope to partner with the World Cup Alliance and on different efforts as we move forward. Dr. Huey, could you explain a little bit? I know in the US we have a national website, clinicaltrials.gov, that's searchable for clinical trials, and we can put in cancer of unknown primary and we get a listing of clinical trials. But I'm assuming there are other ways and other avenues to get information for clinical trials on CUP that you may be aware of.
Yeah, it's a great question. I will admit this is a harder space than I would like for it to be, and I think Tanya will probably agree with that. I mean, I think that there are fewer trials than we would like for cancer of unknown primary specifically, and so that list is unfortunately just not going to be as long as would be ideal. As the structure and design of clinical trials evolves, there are, as Tanya mentioned, basket trials that enroll patients with different types of cancers. They may enroll non-small cell lung cancer and pancreas cancer and ovarian cancer and cancer of unknown primary, for instance. And sometimes this is listed directly as cancer of unknown primary. Other times this is listed as quote unquote other solid tumor, which can include patients with CUP. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all that easy to search. And sometimes there are details around which other solid tumors are included and excluded. I wish I could tell you that I had a great answer to this question or that this was much easier to search than it is. And this is a conversation that I have in the clinic too, and just acknowledge some of the frustration here. It can be very difficult to navigate this. And even as somebody that sees a lot of these patients, it can be harder than we would like to find trials for patients with CUP. I think that as we get more and more into an era where we're looking at biomarker directed treatments, targeted therapies, I think that antibody drug conjugates or ADCs are there's certainly a lot being developed at this time. That is really a space where testing patients with CUP and including a cohort there for a possible tissue agnostic type of approach could be really beneficial for patients. We've seen a couple of tissue agnostic approvals by the FDA in the United States, and we hope for more of those to come about. But I think this is a really wise strategy for drug companies because there are a lot of patients out there. So I would certainly advocate for that to continue to happen over time. Obviously, it would be tremendous to find other opportunities and treatment options for our patients. And I think that again, it's hard to know if there's effectiveness, if we don't even check for the biomarker itself in this patient population. And so I think in discussing drug development for lots of different drugs, it's really important to advocate for this patient population and trial designs that can keep them included.
Thank you. No, I think you made some great points in terms of just how molecular profiling and biomarker-driven care can really help all rare cancer patients, but especially CUP patients. And hopefully there'll be more FDA approvals in the future that can be accessed by CUP patients and rare cancer patients. I want to close before I close this and go into the Q&A. I just want to thank you both, for your insights. I have one final question for both of you, and then I will go into the Q&A. If there was one resource you wish you had while you were navigating this diagnosis for both patients and what you would give as a provider, Dr. Huey, what would it be? What would be that kind of ideal resource?
Depends on how big we want to dream.
Dream big.
Yeah, I mean, I think outside, we obviously want patients to get high quality diagnostic testing. I think that's really important, and the things that we discussed. I will say one perspective on treatment that we really haven't covered yet is that there's been an increasing amount of data that an approach to treatment called site-specific therapy is really important for patients with CUP, which is to say, we want to do an appropriate search to find out where a cancer may have come from, and we want to see what flavor it may resemble of other types of cancers. And then many times we want to treat it in that fashion. So in the same way that we treat colon cancer differently than we treat non-small cell lung cancer, we would select a treatment option, a chemotherapy regimen, really kind of tailored at one or the other for patients with CUP that may have features that resemble those primary cancers. There was a study called the Fudan CUP 001 study that came out of China that really supported this approach, and there have been others who have looked at this as well. I just think rather than picking the most generic chemotherapy, trying to be as specific as possible can be something that can really positively impact patient outcomes. And so that would be my advice. A lot of times what we do in providing a second opinion to patients is say, look, I think we can be a little bit more particular about the treatment that we select. And that's the service that we really try to provide. There's obviously a lot of folks that are doing a great job in the community as well. But I think the approach of site-specific therapy is a really important one. That would probably be the point that I would try to drive home the most for folks who don't see this disease nearly as much as others. But I'm sure Tanya has some really great thoughts as well.
I think one of the things I saw in a meeting once, and it was a center that had brought in a rapid diagnostic red flag system, so that when patients come in at the very, very beginning and they present kind of with advanced kind of, suspicious cancers, that they get into a rapid diagnostic pathway, and then they're supported all the way, as opposed to the current way where you're kind of left wandering around, that if you came in and then you were supported straight away. And I think a huge important part is the MDT and the supportive services, have your palliative care, your psychological support, all those symptom management, and not palliative care for end of life, but for symptom control and symptom management, because the burden of symptoms is so great that quality of life is so important that even while they're waiting for all these tests, that they're kind of being treated too, and just make the journey kind of much more comfortable as such, and that they're a priority from the very beginning, as opposed to when the diagnosis comes later on.
So you both brought up some very good points to think about. One, Dr. Huey talking a little bit about kind of having different types of CUP that you kind of almost bucket, that you're able to kind of tailor personalized therapies in a little bit more directive way based on what you believe kind of the best guess of the primary is based on the various studies. so that it can be a little bit more in the personalized realm of therapies that we've talked about. And then Tanya, you had explained, a lot of the upfront care that needs to be thought about even before a diagnosis of CUP is made. So that's something that I think from a care standpoint, requires a lot of thinking in terms of how to coordinate all these different care teams and making sure that both the physical and the mental aspects are covered in this diagnostic and treatment journey. So both very good points.
Maybe one final plug for the World Cup Alliance that has really great patient education documents and questions that you can work through, a booklet that you can work through in order to make sure you're asking all the right questions. And I think it really helps caregivers become advocates for the patient that they're supporting. And these are really great resources that are available on the website. And so that folks have worked really hard, including Tanya, to make happen.
Brilliant. Thanks. Yes, your thoughts matter. And it's translated into many languages. And it's just a little booklet to bring that, like, just to think about things and think about questions. You might just prompt the caregivers or the patient to ask while they have that short time with the consultant to cover all those areas. Yeah.
And I know we didn't speak as much as I would have liked on the World Cup Alliance, but it is a very, very good resource for patients, and that very fortunate that this organization exists to serve patients. And we hope that this webinar through TargetCancer Foundation can offer some support for US patients, as well as direct them to resources that are available through the World Cup Alliance. So we're really, really happy that we have this partnership and we can work together moving forward to serve this very important population. So this has been very informative for myself, and I'm sure it's been very educational for our viewers today. We do have some submitted questions that I just want to get to make sure that our panelists have a chance to discuss. One of the questions that came in is, what are the primary reasons for why we can't find a primary lesion? Is it possible that we could not find it because it's no longer present and the immune system manages to kill it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is there's a couple of different theories on this. One is that the place where cancer may have started may just be very small. And for whatever reason, rather than growing to be a large mass, the cancer was much more interested in spreading to other parts of the body. And so it could be that something that seems very small has created a big problem elsewhere in the body, and we just don't have a large mass. And we know that different cancers with known primary sites, sometimes they're very large before they spread, sometimes they can be very small. And so I think that principle remains true. Sometimes we're not able to find out, as we've discussed, a lot of times we're not able to find a primary site, and it's conceivable that may not even be seen unless, sadly, an autopsy is done. And so that's a frustrating reality. The other thought is that, yeah, there may have been a normal sized or small primary cancer, but it is possible that the immune system could have eradicated that in some form or fashion. And, we don't know why exactly that happens. It doesn't necessarily mean that patients are more likely to benefit from immunotherapy, which is kind of a question that could follow that. But, I think that one of the things that we know is it's clearly a cancer that is interested in spreading to other parts of the body, as opposed to kind of remaining somewhat dormant or growing in the place where it started. And so there are some unique features there. Those are very much the theories behind why it exists. And I wish we had better answers to those questions.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in is how can patients with CUP in the US create a community to find support? Using World Cup Alliance as a potential example, do you have any thoughts about how we could do that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the goals of the website is to kind of do all that work for patient advocates coming forward. We do know of some interested patient advocates in the US And we were saying to them that we have all the materials there and happy to share our website, and all that work is kind of done, so not to have to do it again. That we can, if a US patient advocate starts up, they can have his place on our website and all the kind of materials and all the kind of connections that go through it. So that's to save all that work, that we are a network straight away, that they can join as such. And there's also Facebook groups. I know there is a Facebook group where a lot of patients do talk to each other there. So there is that kind of support ongoing in the US for that. I know we were only 3 charities in the world. And the guy in the UK has retired. So it was the Missy Tumor Ombagend in the Netherlands, SJK in Ireland, and we have a German patient organization now. And we have a French Rock for Life who are raising huge amounts of money doing musical concerts for the Curie Institute in France. So we're kind of just trying to bring everyone together so that if patient advocates want to start and join us, or patients want any kind of information, that it's all there for them, that they don't have to necessarily worry about setting up a charity or anything too formal, which can take a long, long time. That's our aim, to kind of stop all that extra work for people that exists.
Mhm.
They can do whatever they want with it as such.
And Hetal, we'd be remiss to not shout out the Target-Cancer Foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, exactly.
Right.
What an important,
Our gracious member.
Right.
you guys are doing incredibly important work, and we're so, as we've said, we're thrilled to be here today. And I think your advocacy for patients that have rare cancers is incredibly important, not only to stand up patient information and bring people together and build relationships, but also things like clinical trials. And so, I think that these orphan diseases and rare cancers can feel very isolating to patients. And so to have groups like this is just an incredible benefit.
Thank you.
I agree, Hetal. Absolutely agree. It's fantastic.
Yes, and definitely hope to partner with World Cup Alliance and various centers of excellence around the country to help this very important population. We continue to serve CUP patients through our TRACK study. We have a cohort of CUP patients specifically dedicated in that study, and it's a decentralized trial. So these patients can get free NGS testing and interpretation through our molecular tumor board. So hopefully CUP patients can come find us for not only information, but also potential help in terms of their care moving forward. Well, I think I will close now and just say thank you very much to Dr. Huey and Tanya for their time and their expertise, but also, their willingness to talk about this very, very tough topic that is very difficult for patients to navigate. I know that our viewers today are very thankful for your time, your expertise, and just your sensitivity that surrounds this diagnosis, which is very important. And hopefully the one takeaway is that unknown doesn't mean untreatable, and that information can be very empowering. And we encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our patient resources, this webinar and other previously recorded webinars, the TRACK study as well that we mentioned. And we thank you for being part of our community, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you both again. Have a good afternoon.